The snow had started falling sideways by the time I noticed the balcony door cracked open. It was room 6A, top floor corner unit, the one with the best view of the ridge. We'd booked it to a man traveling alone, didn't catch a name. Paid cash. No luggage, just a long gray coat and a pair of boots that looked military-issued. He'd checked in 3 nights earlier during that blizzard. And now the room was supposed to be empty, but the lights were still on. The heat was off. And the balcony door was ajar, letting the wind whip through like something had gone out or never really left. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever had a job that kept you up through the weather. And if these stories help you drift off, consider following the channel so you don't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 at the time, working the front desk at a lodge up in Colorado, a ski spot mostly tucked into the foothills outside Telluride. I'd taken the job that fall mostly just to get away from some stuff back home in Kentucky. I wasn't much of a skier myself, but I liked the quiet that came with altitude. Nights were long, snow muted everything. You could hear footsteps better, even the strange kind. This was in 2006, the second week of December, right before the big holiday rush. The lodge ran at half capacity until Christmas week, and that year a storm rolled in early and stalled over the region. We got 16 inches in 3 days, and more was expected. It made for pretty pictures, but it also meant power surges, spotty heat in the older rooms, and guests who stayed in their rooms all day, watching weather reports instead of hitting the slopes. That's how I ended up spending most of my nights sitting behind the counter with a space heater on my feet and coffee that tasted like burnt cedar. My only real company overnight was Len, the maintenance guy, who patrolled the property every hour or so and kept the backup generators humming. The man in room 6A had checked in the night the storm first hit. I remember because he arrived right before shift change coat, covered in snow, not a word more than necessary. He didn't give a name, just slid a government-style ID across the desk that I barely got a glance at before he pocketed it again. Said he needed a room for a few nights, paid for 3 in exact cash. No questions about the hot tub or breakfast hours, just asked if the room had a balcony. I gave him 6A because it was the warmest, least likely to lose power, and faced east away from the worst of the wind. He never came back down after that first night. Len mentioned seeing the lights on late, and once said he thought he heard someone moving furniture up there, but I brushed it off. Guests get restless in bad weather. It wasn't until the 4th night that something felt off. His checkout had been that morning, but I noticed around 9 p.m. that the keycard hadn't been returned. Usually not a big deal, people forget, but when I checked the system, there hadn't been any card activity since the night before. No door opens, no TV used, no water logged on the smart meters, nothing. Len offered to go up and check, but I said I'd take it. Honestly, I just wanted to stretch my legs. The snow had let up a bit, but wind still howled in bursts around the side of the building. 6th floor was empty, except for that one room. Carpets always smelled like cedar and lemon up there. But that night, there was something else. Cold air leaking under the door to 6A. I knocked, no answer. Knocked again, louder. The handle was cold when I tried it. The room wasn't locked. I stepped inside expecting to find it dark, maybe heat-blasted and empty. But the light by the desk was on dim, yellow, flickering slightly. The bed was made. Everything in its place. No suitcase, no clothes, no signs of use, except the balcony door was standing open about 6 inches. Wind was whipping the curtains sideways, snow drifting in and catching on the carpet. I stepped forward and closed it carefully. The latch clicked into place, stiff with cold. That's when I noticed the mug on the nightstand. It was one of ours, plain white, with the lodge logo half full, no steam. But what stood out was the smell. The coffee inside was burned. Like it had been microwaved, left reheated, and left again, bitter and metallic. There was a small ring of black liquid dried at the bottom of the cup, but no other dishes, no trash, not even a used towel in the bathroom. The bed hadn't been slept in, or if it had been remade perfectly. Even the throw pillow was aligned. I turned the heat up, logged the inspection in my notepad, and locked the room behind me. When I got back to the front desk, Len was on the radio with someone. He hung up when I came in, told me the generator had kicked on briefly, a flicker in the main circuit. Nothing serious. I told him what I'd seen in 6A. The coffee, the open door. He frowned, said he'd been up there the day before fixing a leak in 6B, and he was sure he'd heard footsteps in 6A around noon, slow, heavy pacing, but the front desk logs showed no one ever came or went. We pulled the keycard report again, still nothing since 10:38 p.m. The night of check-in. No use of the card, no maid access either since he had the Do Not Disturb sign out. Len said he'd sweep the room the next morning just in case. Sometimes guests leave quietly and forget to check out, but I felt something else. Like the room hadn't been abandoned, more like it had been waiting. That night around 1:00 a.m., I stepped outside to check the parking lot. We had 8 cars on site. One of them was still covered in snow, untouched since the night the storm started. A dark sedan gray with no plates. I didn't recognize it, and it was parked in the corner spot near the utility shed. The kind of place you back into when you don't want to be seen. I radioed Len. He didn't answer right away, then came back with, "I know the car. Came in with the storm. That's his." I asked if we should call it in. He paused a long moment, then said, "Not yet. Let's wait and see if he shows up in the morning." But morning came. Checkout came. No one. We called the room again. No answer. No movement. Len went up to check, and this time he brought the master key and his radio. I waited downstairs, watching the cameras. Len entered the room just before 8:00 a.m. You could see the wind catch the curtains again as he opened the balcony door. He came back down 15 minutes later, pale. Said the room was still empty, untouched. But the coffee was warm again, fresh. The same mug, same spot on the nightstand, but steaming this time. We shut down 6A after that, told the booking system it was under renovation. Len said he'd handle the locks. I didn't ask what he meant. I finished that season at the lodge, then took a job downstate in reception for a rehab center. Never went back. But every once in a while I check the weather in Telluride. When the wind's coming in heavy from the west, I think about that room, about the man who checked in just before the storm, about the heat that never stayed on, and the door that never seemed to stay shut. Some guests leave quietly. Others don't leave at all. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those stories that sounds like you're trying to be spooky on purpose, like you're just making things up to mess with someone's head. But this happened back in 2019, and I've replayed it enough times to know I didn't imagine it. It was one of the last fares I ever took before I got out of night driving for good. At the time, I was working for a local taxi outfit in Kansas City. Not one of the apps, this was one of those independent services where you still had to radio in and keep receipts. I was 42, still renting a one-bedroom on the east side, and mostly worked the graveyard shift. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the rhythm of it. Nights were quiet, traffic was light, and the only people out after 1:00 a.m. were either half asleep or too talkative to notice how tired you were. That night had been slow. It was late October, colder than usual for the season, one of those clear nights where the air feels too still, and you start to notice the sound of your own engine ticking at stoplights. I'd just dropped off a couple from Union Station, headed back to their apartment near Independence Avenue. After that dispatch went quiet, I was parked outside an old industrial building off Troost, just south of the river. Most of the warehouses out there had been shut down for years, gutted and turned into storage or satellite offices. At night, it felt like you were on the edge of something too far from downtown to feel watched, too close to it to feel safe. It was 2:17 a.m. when the call came in. Not a radio dispatch, it came straight to the car's console from the main office. A pickup request, flagged as manual input, no phone number listed, just a name field left blank, and a pin dropped in the industrial district near Riverfront Drive. I figured it was a one-off, maybe someone called the office directly or hailed us through an old client account. That wasn't unusual. The address looked like it was near an old machine shop I'd driven past a few times. Kind of place with a rusted-out gate and a barely working security light. No big deal. I got there in about 8 minutes. The pin was behind a building with boarded-up windows and a faded sign that said, Eastern Steel Co. No other cars around. Just me and that kind of silence you only get between trucks coming off the interstate. I almost radioed dispatch to double-check the pickup, but before I could, I saw someone step out from behind the loading dock. Man in his early 40s, maybe clean-shaven black windbreaker, zipped to the neck. He wasn't stumbling or acting drunk, but he moved like he'd been waiting a long time. Arms stiff at his sides, head low. No phone in his hand, no bag. Just walked up and opened the back passenger door without saying a word. I asked if he was the one who called the cab. He just nodded and said, "Yeah. Just need to get somewhere quiet." His voice was even. No accent I could place. It was the kind of tone people use when they're either completely sober or completely out of it. I pulled away from the curb, heading back toward the main road. I asked where he needed to go. No answer at first. He just leaned forward slightly, still looking straight ahead. "Do you know anywhere no one goes after dark?" he asked. Not joking, not weird, just empty, like he really wanted to know. I asked if he meant a park or a motel or what. He shook his head slowly, then mumbled something like, "Just somewhere with no lights." At that point, I figured maybe he was high or just trying to sleep something off. I didn't feel threatened exactly, but something about the way he stared past my head into the windshield made me nervous to look in the mirror too long. I kept driving, cut down by some freight yards, and circled toward an old gas station on Guinote that still had a working soda machine out front. I figured if he didn't give me a real address by the time we got there, I'd stop and make him get out or call it in. That's when he leaned forward again and asked if I'd ever driven someone who didn't belong. I thought he was joking and asked what he meant. He said, "Someone who never paid. Someone who never got out." Then he smiled. Not big, just the corner of his mouth tugged like he knew something I didn't. It made my stomach turn. I told him I didn't get paid enough for riddles. He sat back and went quiet. I pulled into the gas station parking lot and told him this was as far as I was going without a destination. He didn't move, just looked out the window. His hand was resting on the door handle, but he wasn't opening it. I stepped out to stretch my legs, hoping he'd get the message. The gas station was closed for the night, but the lights were still on, flickering overhead fluorescence that made everything look drained of color. The air was dry and metallic like the inside of a vending machine. I walked to the passenger side and tapped the window. He didn't look at me, didn't roll it down, just stared ahead like I wasn't even there. That's when I noticed the windows weren't fogging up, not his side, not mine. It was 39 degrees out. My breath came in clouds, but the inside of the car looked completely still. I opened the door. The seat was empty. The interior light came on. Nothing was disturbed. No marks on the floor mats, no indent in the seat, just cold leather and the faint smell of aftershave, the kind old men wear, the kind you only notice after they're gone. I stood there for a few seconds trying to wrap my head around it, checked the lot, looked around the side of the building, even peeked inside the store window to see if he'd gone in somehow. Nothing, nobody. The only car in the lot was mine. I radioed dispatch, asked them to confirm the call details. There was a pause, then they said they didn't have a record of it, said the console must have glitched, which sometimes happened with older units. I didn't argue, just signed off and started the car again. Before I left, I went inside to grab a coffee from the machine. The clerk was just starting her shift, early 30s, blonde ponytail badge, said Trina. She said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I said something like, "Yeah, maybe I did." She smiled, but not in a friendly way, more like she already knew what I was talking about. Before I turned to go, she said, "You're not the first driver who's dropped someone off here." I asked what she meant. She said, "Some folks show up, get in the car, then disappear before the tank runs empty. Nobody ever picks them up. They just ride until they fade out." I didn't say anything, just walked back to the cab and drove off. I didn't take another fare that night. Drove home through empty streets and double-locked my door for the first time in years. I still keep the receipt from that ride. Printed right there on the dash console, passenger unknown. Fare 0 or more son. Distance 13.7 miles. But the mileage on my car, it went up by 15. I used to love county fairs. Something about the fried smells, the glow of cheap bulbs strung above the booths, the hum of generators, and music bleeding from every ride it made summer feel like it lasted longer than it really did. But I haven't been back to one since 2007. Not after what happened that last night out at the fairgrounds near Wichita. I was 18 back then, about a week out from graduation, and already looking for reasons not to go home. My two closest friends, Charlie and Denny, had their minds set on one last blowout before real life started one last night, to drink bad lemonade, flirt with girls who'd never talk to us in daylight, and maybe sneak onto the Ferris wheel after it shut down. It was the kind of humid Kansas night that made your t-shirt stick to your lower back. The air was thick with the smell of funnel cake grease and wet hay, and the lights from the fair cast everything in that weird, soft orange glow, warm but not comforting. The kind of glow that looks good in pictures, but makes shadows stretch longer than they should. We didn't have a plan. We just wandered the lanes between booths and livestock pens, following sound and movement like dogs off leash. Around 10:30, just as the midway was starting to thin out, we passed a photo booth tucked between the kettle corn trailer and a portable restroom. The booth looked old, like it had been dragged out of someone's garage. The paint was chipped, the curtain frayed, and instead of taking credit cards like everything else, it only took quarters. There was a girl standing outside the booth when we walked by. She looked about our age, maybe younger, wearing a light blue hoodie with the hood up even though the night was still muggy. I remember thinking how still she was. Not nervous, not shy, just still. Like someone waiting for a bus that might never come. Charlie. Being Charlie gave her a smile and said something dumb like, "Hey, you get good lighting in there." She didn't answer, just turned and slipped inside the booth without looking at us. The curtain closed behind her, and we heard the click of the first photo being taken. Denny dared me to stick my head in and make a face in her last shot. I didn't. Something about the whole setup made me uncomfortable, like she wasn't really taking pictures for fun. More like she was documenting something. Proof of where she'd been. We hung around for a few minutes waiting for her to come out, but she didn't. And eventually the fair lights started flickering, signaling closing time. The guy from the popcorn stand shouted over to us to move along, so we did. I turned back once. The curtain was still closed. No sound, no movement. The next morning I saw something on the local news while waiting at a gas station. A girl named Ava Trenton, age 16, had gone missing from the fairgrounds. Last seen around 10:30 near the midway. Her parents were still in the parking lot, looking for her when the booths started closing. I knew it was her. The hoodie, the photo booth. I told Charlie and Denny. We all agreed not to say anything. We hadn't seen her leave, and we didn't want to be dragged into whatever it was. But something about it kept itching at me. A few days later, I went back to the fairgrounds on a whim. Everything was being torn down, trailers, hitched to trucks, booths folded up like dead insects. But the photo booth was still there, tucked in the exact same spot. No power running to it, no cord, no generator, just standing there like it hadn't been moved in years. I pulled the curtain aside. The seat inside was worn through springs poking out, dust everywhere, no camera lens, just a black hole where one might have been like an empty eye socket. There was a faint smell, too, not rot exactly, more like dried rain on metal, like something forgotten. I checked the slot where photos were supposed to print. Empty. But on the side of the machine was a rusted-out coin return tray. Inside was a single strip of film curled from age and heat. 4 pictures. They were faint, overexposed, and streaked with black smudges, but you could still make her out. Ava, sitting alone in the booth. In each shot, her eyes shifted slightly, always looking toward something just out of frame. And in the last one, she wasn't alone. A shape had entered the frame. Not a face, not anything you could name. Just the hint of something closer than it should have been. A blur, almost human, but too tall, too narrow. I took the strip and brought it to the county police station the next morning. They logged it, asked a few questions, and said someone would be in touch. No one ever was. A week after that, Officer Delgado, the one who took my statement, was found parked in his cruiser off a dirt road south of town. Motor still running. Radio hissing static. He was gone. No sign of a struggle. No prints. No calls made from his radio or phone. The cruiser dash cam showed him sitting alone for nearly 4 hours, not moving once. That booth never showed up again. I've gone back most years since just to see. Same fare, same vendors, same crowds. But no photo booth. And no one remembers a girl named Ava Trenton, not even in the paper archives. Not even the police station when I asked a few years back. The woman at the desk said there hadn't been a missing person case like that in at least 20 years. But I still have the strip of film. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe to remind myself that some things do happen even if the world decides to forget. Maybe just to prove to myself I was really there, that she was. And sometimes when the light hits the photo just right, the shape beside her sharpens. It gets a little clearer. And each year it looks more and more like someone I've seen in a mirror. I don't usually stop at places like that anymore. You learn quick driving long stretches for work, which motels are worth your money, and which ones are just walls and locks pretending to matter. But in 2015, heading north through California, I ended up in Sonora late one evening, with nothing left in me to keep driving. The nearest chain hotel was full, and the next town over was another hour through winding hills. My only option was a squat little roadside place, maybe 15 rooms total, sitting against a patch of pine trees with a buzzing neon sign that had been half dead for years. The man at the counter called himself Tony. He looked like he'd been behind that desk for decades, the kind of clerk who didn't bother with customer service anymore. He gave me a key to room 112, mentioned the ice machine was broken, and went back to whatever static-filled ball game was playing on the small radio behind him. The place smelled faintly of mildew and something sweet like old candy melting in the carpet fibers. I dropped my bag inside the room, pulled the curtains shut, and sat for a while, listening to the night traffic roll past. That's when I noticed it. From the window, I could see straight across to the second floor, where room 209 sat almost directly above me. Its light was on. The curtain was half drawn, and someone was standing there. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another traveler stretching their legs. But the longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. She wasn't moving, not shifting, not even adjusting her shoulders. Just standing in the exact center of the window, staring straight out into the parking lot below. I tried to look away, but every time I glanced back, she was there. Same spot, same posture. Pale face, barely visible behind the glass. I never saw her hands, never saw her step back or lean forward. Just a stillness that didn't feel natural. I went back to the front desk after an hour, mostly to ask if there was a diner open nearby. But I also asked about the woman in 209 trying to sound casual. Tony looked up from his radio with something close to irritation. He said there wasn't supposed to be anyone in that room. It hadn't been rented in weeks. Plumbing issue, he said. Out of order. I told him I'd seen someone standing at the window. He frowned, checked the logbook, and shook his head. No key had been signed out. He didn't even have a spare on the hook. He told me I was probably tired and suggested I get some rest. Back in my room, I couldn't let it go. I turned off my lights, cracked the curtain, and stared up at 209. The figure was still there. Same position, same stare. The parking lot light below flickered against the window, and for a second I thought I saw her face clearly. Thin, hollow, expressionless. Like someone remembering how to mimic being alive. Around 2 in the morning, I was woken by the sound of footsteps on the walkway above. Slow, measured like someone pacing back and forth right outside 209. Then the creak of railing metal groaning slightly under weight. I held my breath, listening, every hair on my arms standing up. The steps paused directly above my door. Then silence. I didn't sleep again that night. At sunrise, the room above mine was dark, curtain drawn tight. I checked out early, but before leaving I asked Tony again about 209. He waved me off, said it was empty, said I must have been dreaming. His voice was sharp, almost defensive, like he didn't want to keep talking. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the motel's name online, digging through old news articles. Buried in a local archive was a short piece about a woman found dead in room 209 back in the late 90s. No foul play suspected, just a traveler passing through who never left. The article didn't even give her name, just her age. 33. I haven't stayed in Sonora again. But sometimes passing through another town late at night, I'll catch myself glancing up at the second floors of motels, half expecting to see her again. Standing in the window. Waiting. And once, only once, in a place 200 miles away, I could swear I did. Room 209, curtains half-drawn, light burning faintly against the dark. I used to work nights at a little 24-hour gas station about 10 miles south of Alamosa. It wasn't the kind of place people stopped at unless they had to. Truckers cutting through, folks running late on long drives, and the occasional lost tourist who underestimated how far apart towns can be in Colorado. Most nights were slow, with the loudest thing being the soda cooler kicking on every 15 minutes. What made that job strange wasn't the loneliness or the silence, but the patterns you started to notice after a few months. Regulars who always bought the same snacks, couples that argued in the car before one of them came in to pay. But one pattern I never forgot started in October of 2022 on a night I thought was just like any other. It was 3:17 in the morning, and I remember because the old register we had would beep at exactly 17 past the hour if a card was left in the reader. That's when a small silver sedan pulled up to the far pump. The man who stepped out couldn't have been more than mid-30s. He wore a faded blue hoodie with the hood up and kept his head down the whole time. He came in, nodded without speaking, and asked for $12 of gas. Not 11, not 13, 12. He paid in cash, exact bills, no coins, and went back outside. I thought nothing of it until the next night. Same car, same time, same $12. Exact same bills creased in the exact same way. He didn't make eye contact, didn't grab a drink or a snack, just paid and left. By the third night, it stopped being coincidence. He was coming at the exact same time, using the exact same pump, and asking for the exact same thing. $12, 3:17 a.m., every night. After a week of this, I started to expect him. The chime of the door at 3:17, the soft shuffle of his shoes, the crumpled bills placed on the counter. I tried making small talk once, asking if he was headed to work or just passing through. He looked up briefly, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They weren't glazed or high, just strangely unfocused, like he wasn't entirely in the same room as me. He muttered something about making good time and walked back out. That answer sat wrong with me. Making good time to where? He never had luggage. The back seat of his car was empty, and the route he was taking didn't connect to any major city, just smaller roads that spiderwebbed into the mountains. I mentioned it to the state trooper who came in for coffee some mornings. He shrugged it off, said plenty of folks ran strange routines, and unless the man was drunk or causing trouble, there wasn't much to be done. Still, the trooper said he'd keep an eye out. A few nights later, the man came as usual, but this time when he left, he pulled around the lot slowly before heading back to the highway. For a brief moment, he stopped under the pole light. I could see his face clearly through the windshield. His lips were moving. He was speaking, but not to me, to no one. His eyes flicked up toward the canopy, as though something was there waiting. Then he drove off into the dark. The next night, I decided to check the cameras. We had 4 mounted around the pumps, grainy black and white footage that barely caught license plates. I played back the last week, scrubbing through until I found him. My stomach dropped when I realized something. Each night when he pulled in, there were no headlights visible on the road before he arrived. One frame, the road was empty. The next, his car was under the canopy, already slowing to a stop. That week, he didn't come one night. I stayed tense after 3:17, waiting for the chime of the door that never came. At 3:40, I caught myself feeling relieved, like I'd dodged something I hadn't agreed to face. But the next night, he was back. Same bills, same words, same timing. It was as though the missed night had never happened. Finally, I asked him directly what he was doing out there. He froze, exact change in his hand, and didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he whispered, "It has to be 12, and left without another word. I called the trooper again, who suggested I try to catch the license plate. So the next night when the man came, I stepped outside, casually pretending to sweep near the door. But when I looked at his car, there was no plate. Not missing, just not there. A smooth, blank space where it should have been. That was the last night I saw him. After that, 3:17 came and went like any other time. No sedan, no man in the hoodie, just the empty hum of the coolers and the flicker of fluorescent lights. Months later, I got a call from dispatch asking if we had cameras from October still saved. A silver sedan had been found abandoned off a Forest Service road north of town. Inside was a blue hoodie and 12 crumpled dollar bills laid neatly on the passenger seat. But the engine was rusted solid plants growing through the wheel wells. The car had been sitting there for years. I never told dispatch about the timing or about the way the man spoke that last night. I didn't see what good it would do. But every shift I worked after that, I couldn't help watching the far pump at 3:17 a.m., half expecting to hear the door chime and see him again. I never did. But the worst part was realizing that if I had, I probably would have rung him up like always, handed back his change, and watched him vanish into the night just like before. Back in 2021, I was living out in Nevada doing long-haul mechanic work for truckers who broke down on the lonely stretch between Tonopah and Beatty. It wasn't glamorous, but I knew engines better than people, and in a desert town that was enough to keep me busy. Nights were quiet with the horizon stretching so far, it made you feel like the world was hollowed out, and the sky above looked like something you could fall into. One night in early spring, just after midnight, I got a call through dispatch that a semi had blown a radiator about 12 miles south of Goldfield. It wasn't unusual, so I loaded the truck with gear and set out. The desert air had that dry chill that sneaks in after the heat of the day, and the radio picked up nothing but static until I switched it off completely. The highway was empty except for my headlights carving out a narrow cone of pavement ahead. About 10 miles out, I saw another set of lights parked on the shoulder. It wasn't the semi I was called for, just a small, dark-colored car pulled over with the hazards clicking in an uneven rhythm. 2 men stood beside it, not waving me down, just standing there with their hands shoved into their jackets. I slowed a little more out of caution than kindness, but neither of them moved or called out. Something about their stillness felt wrong, like they were waiting for a cue I hadn't given. I drove past, telling myself they probably had someone else coming, but when I glanced in the mirror, both of them had turned their heads at the exact same time to watch me go. I shook it off and kept driving until I reached the broken-down semi. The driver was a middle-aged guy who seemed genuinely relieved to see me. While I worked, he kept glancing down the road like he was expecting something, and finally he asked if I'd passed a small sedan with 2 men. When I said yes, he let out a slow breath and muttered, "They've been circling all week. Same car. Same guys. No one knows who they are." That put a chill in me. Out here, everyone notices everything. If strangers are looping the same road at the same hours, word spreads quick. I finished patching his radiator and got him moving again, but as I was packing up, I noticed headlights in the distance. They were creeping closer, slower than they needed to. The car eased up behind me, stopped for maybe 10 seconds, then pulled away without a word. I caught a glimpse of the passenger who sat stiff and straight, staring forward without even turning his head. On the way back, dispatch radioed in, asking if I was still on Highway 95. When I confirmed, she told me to hold tight. Highway Patrol was out looking for a vehicle that matched what I'd seen. Stolen plates suspected in 2 separate abductions. I kept driving, telling myself it wasn't my business, but in the desert it's hard not to feel like you're being folded into something larger. I made it back to the shop and tried to let it go, but the next night I got called again. Different breakdown, different mile marker. And there they were. Same sedan, same 2 men, standing by the car in the exact same way, hands in their jackets, faces blank under the glow of the hazard lights. This time, the driver's window was down. As I passed, one of them raised his hand, not waving, just holding it still in the air, as if measuring the distance between us. I kept going, but for the next 5 miles I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling at the edges of my vision, like if I glanced into the rear view, I'd see them closer than they should have been. When I finally did look, the road was empty. No headlights, no car. Nothing but the desert swallowing sound and motion like it always does. Later that week, Highway Patrol stopped by the shop asking questions. They said the sedan had been abandoned out on a dry lake bed, no tracks leading to or from it. Inside were 2 coats folded neatly on the back seat. No wallets, no IDs, just the smell of gasoline and dust. The officers didn't say much else, but I caught one of them muttering that the car had been reported stolen nearly a month before from a town 2 states over. I thought that would be the end of it, but about 2 weeks later, I was heading home after a late job. It was just after 2 a.m. The road so still it felt like I was the only person alive. That's when I saw the glow ahead hazard lights pulsing in that same uneven rhythm. I slowed without meaning to. The same car, the same 2 men, same posture, same faces. Though this time I realized something that made my stomach knot. They weren't older or younger, not thinner, not heavier. They looked exactly the same as they had the first night, right down to the angle of their shoulders and the way their hands were tucked into their jackets. I drove past without looking, but I couldn't help glancing into the mirror. They turned their heads in unison again, perfect timing, like they were one body split in 2. The glow of their hazard lights faded behind me, and then the road went black. I never saw them again after that night. A few months later, I left the desert work behind. It wasn't because of them, at least, that's what I told myself, but more because I realized how easily time can come apart when you spend your nights on empty highways waiting for things you can't name to appear on the horizon. Still, whenever I drive that stretch south of Goldfield, I catch myself watching for the flicker of hazard lights out in the distance. And I know if I ever see them again, the hardest part won't be understanding who they are. It'll be convincing myself not to stop. When I was 19, I rented a ground-floor apartment just off campus in Ypsilanti, Michigan. It wasn't much, a square little place with thin walls, cheap blinds, and a view of the parking lot that never changed. I didn't have many friends back then, so I spent most nights buried in schoolwork, coding assignments glowing on my laptop until I lost track of time. The building was mostly quiet except for the occasional muffled music or the sound of someone slamming a door after an argument. The first time I noticed something strange was on a Tuesday, close to 2 in the morning. I was half asleep when I heard a knock at my door. Not urgent, just a soft, steady rhythm. When I opened the blinds, no one was there. I figured it was drunk students playing around and went back to bed. But the knocking kept happening every few nights, always late, always soft, never followed by footsteps. My neighbor across the hall, an older man named Harris, told me not to worry. He said the building had wanderers who sometimes mistook one door for another. But what unsettled me was that the knocking was always directed at my unit. When I mentioned it to the building manager, she gave me a look I didn't understand at the time and said quietly, "That's more of a Unit 1A problem." Unit 1A was directly beneath me. I almost never saw the tenant, just caught glimpses of him through the stairwell window when he came or went. He was pale with close-cropped hair and always wore the same gray hoodie. He didn't smile or nod when we passed each other, just lowered his eyes, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. One night I stayed up coding, headphones off for once, and I realized the knocking wasn't random. It started below me, a few raps on the door of 1A, then traveled upstairs to my own door like whoever it was wanted to be sure they were climbing in order. Around 2:20, it came again, slow and deliberate. I didn't open it, but I sat there in the glow of my laptop, heart hammering, staring at the thin wood between me and whatever waited on the other side. The next morning I found something slipped under my door. It was a folded piece of paper, blank on one side, with 3 words written in cramped pencil on the other. Don't answer late. I didn't know who had written it. The handwriting looked shaky, maybe rushed. I slid it into a drawer and tried to forget it, though forgetting never worked for long. The real turning point came a week later. I was walking back from class just past midnight when I saw them 3 figures standing at the entrance to the complex. They weren't talking, just waiting, hands at their sides, faces shadowed. I pretended not to notice, hurried past, and locked my door fast. At exactly 2 a.m., the knocking began again. This time, it didn't stop. It went on for nearly 20 minutes, soft but relentless, as though the knocker had no need to rest. The next morning, I saw my downstairs neighbor leaving his apartment. He looked thinner than usual, his eyes ringed with dark circles. Before I could say anything, he muttered, "You heard them, didn't you?" I asked what he meant, but he only shook his head and said, "Don't answer. Never answer." Then he walked off down the sidewalk, moving quickly, like he was late for something, though he carried nothing with him. I didn't see him again after that. The following week, the manager taped a notice to the door of Unit 1A, saying the tenant had broken his lease. When I asked about it, she frowned and said he just left, didn't even take his things. The apartment sat empty after that, but the knocking didn't stop. The worst night came in late November. I was lying in bed watching the shadow of tree branches swaying on my ceiling when I heard not one knock, but several doors slamming in sequence across the building. I opened my door a crack and froze. Down the hallway, every apartment door stood ajar just slightly, except mine. The air smelled faintly of earth damp and raw, though it hadn't rained in days. And faintly beneath the hum of the building, I heard a whisper that seemed to come from the floor itself. "Open up." I shut the door fast and leaned against it until dawn. By morning, the hallway looked normal again. Every door closed, no trace of moisture, no evidence anything had happened at all. I finished out my lease, but moved out the same day finals ended. Before I left, I passed the empty doorway of Unit 1A and noticed the blinds drawn tight, though no one had been inside for weeks. As I carried the last box to my car, I heard the sound again, soft, steady knocking from somewhere inside that vacant unit. I didn't stay long enough to see if anyone answered. That was the last story I wanted to share tonight. Looking back on all of these memories, I realize they have one thing in common. None of them happened in the places you'd expect. They weren't in haunted houses or battlefields or anywhere people point to when they tell ghost stories. They were in gas stations, small towns, cheap apartments, and stretches of highway that thousands of people pass every day. What unsettles me most is how ordinary these places were. That's what lingers the idea that nothing marked them as dangerous until the quiet details started to add up the wrong face in a crowd, the sound of footsteps, where none should be the sense that time itself had slipped. You carry those moments with you even years later, and they shape the way you look at the world when you think you're safe. Maybe that's the real thread tying these stories together. The horror isn't always in what you can see, but in the knowledge that it might happen again at any time, in a place you think you know. Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope these stories kept you company tonight, even if they left you with a few uneasy thoughts before sleep. If you'd like to hear more stories told in this quiet way, consider subscribing and sharing the channel with someone who might enjoy them. And tell me, have you ever had a moment in your own life When a place you trusted suddenly felt wrong in a way you couldn't explain.